everyone, to another episode of Currently Speaking, the podcast of the Current Consulting Group. I'm Bill Current, founder of the Current Consulting Group, and I'm joined once again by Brian Feeley, Vice President of the Current Consulting Group. Welcome, Brian.
Hey, Bill. Well, thank you. I appreciate that.
Now, this is another in our ongoing series on oral fluid drug testing. These podcasts are posted on Spotify, YouTube, Apple. You can find it wherever you normally look for podcasts, and we welcome you to visit our website as well to look at archives of past podcasts and other information that we have about drug testing and about oral fluid testing in particular. Now, as I mentioned, this is one in an ongoing series, so check back for additional episodes of Currently Speaking for more information about oral fluid testing. But today we're going to kind of cover an advanced topic. Brian, you want to introduce today's topic to our audience?
Sure, Bill. We're going to talk today about things that really pertain to the package insert of a product. And that was in a previous podcast that we did. So we're going to get into terms like intended use of a product, the FDA terminology, a little bit about what FDA clearance means and what new labeling means called E&I, or employment and insurance use. And I'll probably talk a little bit about forensic use only too, because these are terms that are inside some of the package inserts. They're referred to in the industry a lot, but people sometimes get the terms confused or really don't know what they mean. Now, if you have no involvement with product selection or reading package inserts or needing to know about the particulars of a product like this podcast may not be for you. But if you happen to be the person that's in charge of selecting products, needs to know how they would perform for your customers, or you are a user of a product and need to know a little bit more about these sort of things, I think you might find this kind of interesting.
Okay, so let's get started. Why is this important? Why is the labeling important, and the term intended use? What's that all about?
Yeah, so the labeling and what you find in the package insert really is a full description of what that product was designed to do, how it should perform, what level of approval or clearance it might have. Of course, a product insert, as I talked about in a prior podcast, has a lot of the data in there. Performance data. How did it perform when tested against a decent number of samples that were selected and performed in a clinical study? But starting off with the term intended use. So really, that's typically what you're going to find at the beginning of a product insert, kind of at the one of the first paragraphs that you read. You'll see the name of the product, and then you'll typically see intended use. And so that really tells you what that manufacturer has developed and what they're claiming that test does. And I'll give you an example. So a rapid oral fluid test, for example, let's call it the XYZ test, is a qualitative screen for drugs of abuse in human oral fluid. It is intended for employment and insurance use only. So I just read you the description of a intended use, or kind of a typical intended use that you might read, and it seems rather straightforward, right? But there's a lot of information in that intended use statement. First, I said it was a qualitative test, right? So that tells you it's kind of a yes or no answer around a cutoff. It's not quantitative. We talked about, I said it was for drugs of abuse and that it was for human oral fluid. So it tells you it's a drug test. It should work in human oral fluid. That was the matrix that was studied. And that also it's intended for employment and insurance use. It doesn't say FDA cleared or IVD, in vitro diagnostic. And I'm going to talk in a minute a little bit more about the employment and insurance use terminology, because that's relatively new. But that's basically what the intended use is. It really should tell you what they're claiming for that product and what it's intended to be used for.
Okay, so we hear a lot about FDA clearance, 510K FDA clearance. What is that, and why would that be important?
Yeah, so FDA clearance historically has been the level of clearance that you would get for an in vitro diagnostic product like this, one that's used for drug testing, one that might be used in a hospital, a clinical setting, one that might be used for in the workplace, of course, for drugs of abuse testing. And historically, the FDA has taken that as something under their jurisdiction, right? And there's also a term called FDA approved. Some people call that confuse the clearance with an actual approval. The FDA doesn't really approve any of these types of in vitro diagnostic tests. They approve drugs and things that are more related to pharmaceutical type products. But for diagnostic products, the FDA doesn't really approve anything. They clear it for use in a particular intended use that we just talked about. And they typically issue something called a 510K. And that is basically it gives it a special number for that particular product. And it says that the FDA has reviewed your submission and they find it to meet the intended use, the labeling is appropriate, that you've done the studies that are necessary for that type of product. And importantly, that you have compared it to something else that's already on the market, another product that has an FDA clearance. They call that a predicate device. And so that basically is what the FDA does. The reason it's all important is because it tells you as an end user that the manufacturer, the developer of that test, has taken it through all of the right sort of studies and protocols and through the FDA, who has reviewed that product and given it that clearance level to say, we find it to be compliant with what you said that kit will do, and therefore you can market it under that for that intended use.
So if a state law, for example, let me throw you a curveball here. If a state law, for example, allows point of collection testing with oral fluid, but somewhere in that state law it mentions, the requirement to use an FDA cleared device, would all products qualify then, or only the ones that actually have this 510K clearance?
Yeah, so if it's called out in a state law and it's actually mentioned, usually that would come out of like one of the health departments, for example, would get involved sometimes with state laws, and they provide language to the states for following in terms of what the specifications might be on a certain product. If they've specifically called out FDA cleared, then they're looking for that product to have that 510K clearance. And there's really no way around that. There is a new designation that we're going to talk about next that I think people need to be aware of, particularly companies that might write terminology into their policy, or states that issue laws or refine their laws. They need to be aware of this new one because it's kind of important.
Well, before we go to that, let me ask this then, because I know back in your days at OraSure, you talked a lot about the device being FDA cleared and possibly the assays being FDA cleared. So how would someone know whether both are FDA cleared?
Well, by reading the insert and asking the provider that they're working with. So you called out the example at OraSure. We had the Intercept device itself, and then we had the assays that are used in the laboratory to do the testing. And back in the day, the way we did that we're talking 2000, you had to get the device FDA cleared and the assays FDA cleared, and then you sort of married them together. One was cleared with the other, more or less. Now today, you're not necessarily required to get separate FDA clearances. You're required to get the FDA clearance for the assay itself and using the device as part of that FDA submission. So you'll do all your studies with, let's say if we were doing the Intercept device today, we would have done all the studies with the assays to get FDA clearance, but the device would have been used in all the collections and all the procedures, and it would have been written into the package insert for the assays that it was used with the Intercept device. And so the Intercept device more or less gets cleared with the assays. But many years ago, you actually applied for them separately, which was more work.
Let's move on to this other designation, E&I. I see that a lot now. What does that stand for, and how does it affect what employers can do with a device?
Yeah, it's really interesting because as a result of the FDA reviewing products, medical devices. A couple of years ago, there was something called the Cures Act, I believe it was, and the whole idea of it was to help manufacturers and people in the industry like ours to get products out onto the market without going through all the more rigorous approvals that you need and clearances that you need from the FDA based on risk category. And so what they essentially did was they established this new category called employment and insurance use only, which is they deem to be a little bit lower risk than some other diagnostic products that need to go through the full 510K clearance procedure. And so the E&I labeling, employment and insurance use labeling, is something that the diagnostic companies in our space are beginning to use for drugs of abuse tests. And, just to be very clear about this, it primarily pertains to non-regulated testing. So if you're going to go to do, let's say, take an oral fluid test today through and have it used in SAMHSA, federal or DOT testing, that still has to go through the full 510K FDA clearance process. You can't use an E&I labeled product for that. But if you're in the non-regulated market, let's say staffing, or you're doing retail, or you're in the hospitality area, whatever your customer or whatever space you might be in, you can use these products that have the E&I labeling on them. So it's important for an employer to know that in case they did have more stricter terminology in their policies, like FDA cleared products are part of it and they must use that, or a state, for example, who's not necessarily only considered with federal or DOT testing, they're also concerned about non-regulated testing. They may want to begin to use this terminology, this employment and insurance use terminology, in those write-ups, because it is something that a lot of companies are doing today. The one thing that I'll say about that level of clearance is because the FDA really doesn't review your product. It's not going through the same rigor of examination that the FDA would typically do. The manufacturer is more or less self-certifying themselves, giving them that E&I labeling. And you tell the FDA that you've created this product and it has an E&I label. But frankly, it's up to the manufacturer and the developer to do the tests that they would otherwise do and make sure they're, dotting the I's and crossing the T's. And that falls more back on the regulatory department of those companies. So my only caution is to make sure that when you are adopting a product that has that E&I labeling on it, that they've done the studies, they've looked at, human oral fluid, they've done the right, mix of positives and negatives, and they have good sensitivity and specificity and accuracy, and they haven't cut any corners.
One other term that comes to mind, which is for forensic use only. What does that mean, and why would that be important to employers?
So it's probably not as important to employers as it is in other markets, but it's worth calling out. Just in case someone gets a product or sees something come across their desk that says forensic use only, and you are in the employment market, that's kind of a watch out. So forensic use only has traditionally been used in markets like criminal justice and law enforcement, and prisons and that sort of setting, and in forensic toxicology labs. So the interesting part is, though, that some laboratories will take a forensic use only product, and they will validate it for an intended use, which could be in the workplace market. And so, not that that's wrong, but that doesn't mean necessarily that it has the same credentials of an FDA cleared product. It just means the laboratory took a forensic use product that was shown to work for a certain type of sample type and a certain type of application, and the laboratory adapted it to do something they wanted to do for their customers. And so if they do ever get inspected, they're going to need to show that data, how they validated the product, how it's used. And, again, they would want to use some caution with regard to regulated markets, because that would cross over that line a little bit. And so, that's something to watch out for. And the other thing about forensic use products and doing those lab developed tests is there's been an awful lot of discussion over the last decade or more about LTDs. It's called a lab developed test. And so labs have traditionally done this a lot, and many of them, probably most of them, do a very great job at what they do to develop that lab developed test. But the FDA has stepped in. There's been lots of discussion about whether they're going to allow for that, or if they are going to allow for it, what are the constraints that are going to be put on laboratories? What are the things they're going to have to do that are going to have already made it pretty complicated for them to do that? That whole LTD subject is enough for a whole nother podcast, so we won't go too far into it. But it's very interesting, and it's important to those people, particularly in the clinical lab space, that utilize that process to get tests out onto the market for us to be able to use.
So as oral fluid testing grows in popularity due to the DOT regulations, state laws like the marijuana laws in California and Washington that prohibit employers from using drug tests that show only the presence of a non-psychoactive metabolite, whereas with oral fluid testing, you're detecting the parent drug. This labeling becomes ever more important. It just seems to me that it's even though oral fluid testing has been around for a long time, decades, it's new to a lot of employers, and it's even new to a lot of drug testing providers. And so among all the different topics that we're covering as part of this series, this intended use, the product labeling, the product insert, what does FDA clearance mean, when is it required, and then this new designation, or relatively new designation, E&I, employment and insurance, that really becomes something that's important for employers and providers to know. Anything else on that, Brian?
Well, so yeah, and you're absolutely right. It will be more important. And then there's also this category of tests that don't necessarily need FDA clearance because they're not being used on a biological specimen. And we've talked a little bit about this and it will come up in a webinar related to surface testing, which is a new thing that's coming about, not necessarily new, but new in the workplace market and in school testing, where you're testing, let's say, a vape pen, or you're testing a surface or a baggie, or you find an edible, what looks like an edible, right, in a school or in a workplace setting. There are tests that can be used to swab that surface and be able to tell you whether there's a particular class of drug that might be in that, such as cannabis or fentanyl. Those don't fall under FDA, so they don't fall under the same regulation. So we'll have to also be able to, as we look forward here in new podcasts that we'll do as those sort of products come about, and you look at things like an impairment test that you put on your eyes, these goggles that are coming out, which is another one that we'll touch on. Those don't fall under the FDA either. So there are going to be categories of products as new emerging things come out that we'll have to differentiate where the FDA clearance is important and where it's not important.
Well, let's veer off onto that track just for a second.
Sure.
So for the audience, Brian and I just worked on an article that's going to appear in the newsletter What's the Buzz, which is the OraSure newsletter. And it's sort of on how some emerging technologies kind of go hand in hand with oral fluid testing and create this comprehensive approach to addressing substance abuse in the workplace, or more specifically, impairment in the workplace. And you mentioned impairment-specific tests.
Yep.
But as part of that article, we also talked about a product from Buzzkill Laboratories, or Buzzkill Labs. And I thought that was particularly interesting because it's an oral fluid test, but it's different than a lot of the oral fluid tests that are out there. What do you like about that? What intrigues you as somebody who's been dealing with the oral fluid testing business for a quarter of a century? What's sort of intriguing about that?
Yeah, so it's neat because number one, it is based on an oral fluid sample. So you provide a small sample into a device, and then it gets inserted into a cartridge. And within that cartridge, they're actually separating out, if you will, the active psychoactive form of the drug, delta 9 THC, and while that's done somewhat with the other immunodiagnostic tests that are on the market, this one is actually more refined and more specifically separating out Delta 9 THC, which gives you that ability to test for only that psychoactive form of the drug. And in a format where that oral fluid sample can go into the cartridge, put into a device, and within a short period of time at a clinic or in a point of care or point of a collection setting, you can have a result for THC in short order. And I think it's another way to get to the problem and address the issue of these states now that are creating these languages and laws that restrict testing for metabolite. It's another way to do it. It's quick and it's done on the spot. And I know that the Buzzkill Labs folks are going to be adding other drugs to the capability of that system to be able to pick those up a little further down the road. So it'll become more inclusive, not just for THC.
Thank you. So
Sure.
we have an episode, a podcast episode with the folks, Jeff Heimberger at Buzzkill Labs, and so we encourage you to go look at that. I think you'll just find it fascinating. Some of these new technologies that are starting to gain some traction and some notoriety, I think, represent sort of the future of where we're going as an industry and as a market for drug testing. Brian, thank you again, as always, for a lot of great information. And to our audience, look for more episodes of Currently Speaking in our series on oral fluid testing. And with that, we'll conclude today's episode. Thanks for joining us.